to People Like Us, a podcast for and about third culture kids everywhere. I'm Jen Mohindra. I'm also a TCK, and I have a Facebook group for TCK adults called, unsurprisingly, People Like Us. So, good morning. I'm pleased to have Paul McGuigan with me today on this episode of People Like Us. Hi, Paul. How are you doing?
Hi, Jen. I'm good. Thank you. How are you?
Yeah, good. Thank you. So, I'm going to jump straight in and start off by asking you, so where did you grow up?
Yeah, so whenever I get asked that, sort of, where are you from? It's get a cup of tea time and make yourself comfy. So, so my parents are from the west coast of Scotland, sort of Greenock and Gourock area. In the 60s, they emigrated to New Zealand, and I was born in Hastings in New Zealand in 1968. And they came back to the UK when I was still a baby. So my first memories are of Greenock, but it's only very few memories because when I was maybe 3 or 4, we moved to Staffordshire in England, and then at age 4 or 5 to Australia, and then at about 6 or 7 to New Zealand again, and across the equator on my 9th birthday, coming back from New Zealand. We stayed in Scotland for about 6 months and then moved back to Staffordshire to the same street, believe it or not. And I lived in England until I was about 21 and moved back to Scotland, where I've been ever since. And I
So
think
that's
I've had
quite
about
a
20, had
quite
about
a
20,
quite a
sorry?
few miles you covered at a very early age there. Um,
Yeah.
I hadn't realised you'd spent the time in Australia, but I do remember from our brief time of working together your like of Neil Finn.
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
so now I get where that comes from.
Even though he's a Kiwi, it's pure coincidence, just like the music.
So so what was it like for you doing all those moves at such a young age?
I think, to be honest, because it started so early on, I don't remember having any anxiety or it being a big thing about leaving schools, leaving friends, moving house, stuff like that, possibly because it happened so regularly.
Mm-hmm.
But the overwhelming thing, and the thing I've reflected on over the years, was really trying to fit in, um, trying to take in differences in culture. I mean, moving from Scotland to England, as I'm sure vice versa, there's a lot of things to get used to. But taking on the Pacific, moving to Australia, and suddenly, I mean, even the quality of the light is different. Um, you've got accents to contend with, you've got currencies to contend with, and when you're at school, especially, I guess, primary school, the importance of your knowledge of popular culture it seems so important. So when the kids would be talking about a cartoon and you didn't know what they were talking about, you got this real sense of, oh my God, I'm a freak, and I need to understand all of these things, and I need to fit in. And then, like in Australia, it was a relatively short time, maybe a year, possibly 2 years. We had a few different addresses there as well. So again, you're getting used to different neighborhoods, and then in a short space of time going to New Zealand, which was different again. And again, the memory's a little bit hazy because I was so young, but now I sort of appreciate, I think, the American influence on New Zealand,
Mm.
possibly in TV and movies and things like that. But when you're a kid, they're big, big
Uh-huh.
things. But it got to the stage where, when we came back to Scotland, and that's sort of where I thought I was from, and we're staying with an uncle, and I was 9 years old, and went out and sort of started speaking to the local kids from the block of flats we were staying in, and I thought, these kids will understand me. These are, we are kind of from the same place, and all I got was like, "Are you American? What's your voice is really strange, and why don't you know what Iron Brew is?" And so it was like, why isn't this working? Why is this strange? And then, moving to England again, it's the same thing all over again. It's like, you the kid that lived in Jamaica and everywhere. And it's like, well, no. And it was a mix of either kids being really interested in where you'd been, or kids being really annoyed that you seem to have something interesting about you, and you get accused of being the big I am. And it's like,
Mm.
I just want to fit in somewhere and understand and play, and
Yeah, you touch on some of the themes that I hear quite frequently when speaking with other TCKs, the one around coming back to your home country, but you feel like, well, it's your home, it's Scotland, but the kids there seeing you as something quite different, and you mentioned the accent and the American culture in New Zealand, which I'm hearing that influenced your accent as well.
yeah,
And then the sort of how to gauge what reactions you're going to get when you start telling people about your background, and that risk of, do people think you're bragging? But to you, that's just your life. That's the way it was.
yeah. That's it in a nutshell.
So moving to the UK, that was about 10ish, I think, after Australia and New Zealand, brief stint back in Scotland. And
Yeah.
then you spent a considerable chunk of time there. So what did that feel like, to have your first sort of solid chunk of time in one place?
It was good to. It felt good to, I guess, feel settled somewhere. Although, as I say previously, I don't remember having any big problems with moving from country to country. But it was enjoyable to sort of get settled. In the street we stayed in, my dad was a prison officer, which, throughout the second round of emigrations and in England, he was a prison officer. So the street was all prison officers' families, and an awful lot of kids. And it
Mm-hmm.
was the first time we sort of settled and made sort of longer term friends. Although even then, and to be fair, right throughout my teenage years, even I'd said about accents being different, and myself and my sister, who's 5 years older than me, we both adopted English accents, completely fake. So when you're out playing with the kids, and it's that, just so you're not kind of identified as being weird or different, and so you fit in.
Mm-hmm.
And we both did that. It made it really difficult when the kids were around my house, because if my mum spoke to me
Mm-hmm.
and I tried to answer her, and the really tricky thing is the vowel sounds. You can get away with consonants, but
Yeah.
vowel sounds, saying things like, no, but do you guys want something to drink? And it's like, do I say no, or do I say, oh no, thank you, I'm all right? It was really a big thing for me, and I think my sister had the same thing. And then you get things like, I mean, it always my parents are Scottish, so even when we were abroad, you'd hear Billy Connolly, which is probably why my language is so terrible now. And you'd get the sort of Scottish Sunday papers in New Zealand, and things like that. So I kind of had a sense of that, but I sort of learned quite quickly, especially in the late 70s, when England hadn't qualified for the World Cup and Scotland had, it wasn't something we talked about. Because that suddenly marked it out. It's like, right, okay, you might not know where you're from, but to us, you're Scottish, and this is a thing to kind of have a go at you about. But a large degree of that's kids being kids.
Yeah.
But certainly we both had catching up to do schooling wise. In retrospect, I probably should have been in the year below I was at school. Because certainly things were a bit behind at the school we were at in New Zealand. But my birthday being August, I was borderline one year or the next. So everything felt like catching up and fitting in, but having a longer period in England in the same street meant that you could sort of settle down and get into a pattern of things. So in that respect, that made life a bit easier, at least sort of knowing people longer term and getting used to the geography of a place and that kind of thing.
Yeah, what you described sounds quite potentially draining or tiring. The constant attempts to fit in, keeping up with the accent, probably missing out on cultural references, and I don't. So the next move then to Scotland at 21.
Yeah.
How was that? So going home again.
So it was. I mean, even just before that, so I lived in Stafford for about 10 years, went right through high school there. But when I left school, I joined the police force straight from school, and because it was a county-wide thing, started to meet young people from north of the county, like Stoke-on-Trent, and south of the county, sort of Wolverhampton way, towards Wolverhampton. And even that was a sort of a bit of expansion, and because those people were so different culturally, they were so different, and the accents again, started to feel a bit like, well, we've been in one place for a long time, but I ended up moving to Stoke-on-Trent. I bought my first house in Stoke-on-Trent and settled in there and adopted their accent as well. It's quite freakish. But yeah, come the time, sort of, I was married and thinking about having kids and stuff like that, and we'd been up to Scotland to visit relatives, and I wasn't really close to most of my relatives up here, but one uncle we saw a fair bit of, and we used to go and stay with him, and it just sort of came up. There was an opportunity where a naval base had closed, and there was quite a lot of cheap housing, so it was like, hey, why don't we do this? And I had this thing, it's like, yeah, if I'd like my son to be born in Scotland. Not that it makes any difference, but it's just like I felt like it's where I was from. So that prompted the move. But again, sort of moving up, I felt like I was coming home, and pretty quickly it was apparent that there's areas I know and there's people I know and things like that, but it's not. I'm different from the people here. And I can try and my it was okay to use my natural accent and stuff like that, but even that, people in Scotland were kind of like, where are you from? What's why aren't you a Rangers or a Celtic fan? Why don't you like haggis? It was. I felt probably no more at home than I did anywhere else,
So
which was
that
just
feeling
quite
different. What would you say the impact was of that?
I think by that stage, to be absolutely honest, a lot of the stuff up until then was about confidence. Now, you asked earlier about sort of impact, and that constant sort of the need to fit in, and it kind of extends to your views and opinions on different things, and you either fit in with things or you just keep quiet about something. And the first bold move before we moved back to Scotland was, I was thinking about it one day and thought, you know, I think in a Scottish accent, so why do I speak in an English accent? And there's nothing wrong. My English accent was actually very nice. It was very good. But it sort of annoyed me. So I went into work one day and said to everybody, look, this is my natural accent. From now on, this is what you're going to hear. And they thought it was strange, but got used to it. So when I came back to Scotland, that was fine. But everything else, like I say, the outlook and attitudes towards different things, it was all about just, I guess, trying to learn again about the culture and work out my own identity. And to be honest, it was when my son was born. When my son was born, it sort of really completely changed me and gave me a level of confidence in everything. So if I didn't like the way people spoke or behaved, I'd say something about it. I was no longer afraid to sort of voice my own opinions, even if they were in stark contrast to the local area or what people were used to hearing. And that's been a bit of a journey ever since. So the last, almost 20 years has been about being myself and just repeatedly convincing myself before everything. It's like, it's okay to be yourself. You don't have to fit in with everybody else. You don't have to sound like other people. And if they think it's strange, that's their problem.
That sounds like a tremendously valuable achievement to have reached that place. Are you able to articulate what it was about having your son that gave you that confidence?
I think it probably helped that at the time I was doing a really awful job working in a hotel, and the owner was probably as bad a person as you could work for. He was just ridiculously horrible. So I probably wasn't that far from breaking point.
Right.
And then when my son was born, it was kind of any of my friends that, when they're expecting kids since, and they've said, what's it like? It's like, I like analysing stuff and I like talking about things. And I said, but it's the one thing I can't tell you, because when you go through it and you see your child for the first time, you can't adequately describe that to someone, what it does to you.
Sure.
And it was the thing in my head was, look, I've done this. Obviously, my wife helped, but I've done this. He's a part of me. This is no one else. No one else could have done this. And he's more important than anything. Any other trivial thing just doesn't matter. Just really doesn't matter. And literally the next day, because I didn't get time off from work, literally the next day, the first ridiculous thing that the manager said, I just disagreed with him, confronted him. It was one of those, saloon bar moments where the piano stops and everybody kind of were like, what? And I thought, what's the worst thing that could happen here is he can sack me and I can get literally any job will be better than this one. It's so awful. It's so bad. And that little sort of switch, that little change has stayed with me and been applied to bigger and more important situations as we've gone along. But it really was a catalyst. It was like, stop worrying about things that aren't important. Be disciplined and deal with things. I guess responsibility wise, it really sort of drove priorities and made me a bit more responsible and a bit more practical and pragmatic. And it's something that's built. It's a thing that developed quite rapidly in a few years after that.
Mhm,
But
mhm.
yeah, I'm a very different person from who I was when I was 20. That's for sure.
So when you had your first child, and having had the TCK experience yourself growing up, was that a consideration for when you had a child? Like, did you want him to have a stable lifestyle and to be brought up in one place in Scotland, or did you think about potentially having him move around like you had done?
Well, do you know, I've spoken to, I mean, I should say as well, 5 years later, I had a beautiful daughter as well, and the pair of them are amazing, obviously growing up now.
Hmm.
And I've had this conversation with both of them because they were sort of interested in, where I came from anyway, but having a conversation with them about it's really good that the place we lived in where they were born, they see that as home because um, it's where they were born, it's where they grew up and had their formative years. My daughter still lives there. My son moved to Glasgow some years ago. But even my son being away from there, it's still within reach, which was
Hmm.
something I never had. Um, and I also took them to. I'm very very lucky in that my very first memories are of the street I lived in Greenock when I was about 3, 4,
Hmm.
and about 6 years ago. I went with my son to see if the street's still there, and it's not only still there, but the sort of 1950s cafe that my
Oh,
mom used to
wow.
take me to get sweets was still there, and the same guy was still running it.
Oh,
And
fantastic.
I got to take some photographs of the street and of the cafe, and the whole surrounding area has been sort of demolished and replaced. So this is like the last little outpost. So it's very,
Hmm.
very lucky to be able to photograph some of my first memories. But said to both of them that the really good thing is you've got like an anchor point when someone says where you're from. It's an easy answer, and you've got that familiarity, and I guess somewhere in the globe that is like some sort of magnetic pull for you. The places, there's people there's shops and all the rest of it that you remember going back. But I'd highly encourage them to at least travel and experience other cultures, and don't be afraid to get beyond it. Because the upside of staying in the same place or having grown up in the one place is that you have a sense of where you're from, and that familiarity and an investment in what happens there.
Hmm.
The downside of that is if you spend all of your time there, maybe you're at risk of becoming less tolerant of anything that's different, anybody that's different. And where I had to go to school in a country where, so in New Zealand, for example, specifically in New Zealand, with half of the class were Maori kids,
Hmm.
um, and the rest of the class were pretty much um, you know European New Zealanders, but I was the outsider. I had to fit in,
Yeah.
and Australia was like kids from just everywhere. Every European country. It was quite crazy, and I had to think about fitting in, and I had to think about being the outsider and how I was sometimes treated. And my kids, I wanted them to have that sort of in mind when they're sort of dealing with anybody that's new, unfamiliar, and I think it's just it's a good thing to put yourself in that position. Um, and we did that with them on holidays when we were kids.
Mm-hmm.
The first time I took them abroad, it was to like a camping thing in France. It was full of Irish and Scottish people because of the school holidays.
Yeah.
It was good. It was a good holiday, but the years after that, I picked places that were in the middle of nowhere in France, and it's French people, and you've got the language to deal with, and you've potentially got people looking at you going, bloody tourists, and really sort of experience it, which they did. They were fantastic, and and even though my daughter's lived in Dunoon all of her life and still does, she's I think we've talked about that enough and tried to do different things where she is completely open.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I know a lot of people where she lives that have that mindset. It's like this is our territory and we don't like change and it's not what we're used to. And
So even without the actual TCK experience of having lived in different places, you've been able to offer a broader way of thinking to your kids by exposing them to different cultures and having a glimpse of feeling like you're the outsider. You're not the one that's from there.
I hope so. Yes.
So what makes a place, or what makes somewhere feel like home for you?
So for me, and I think interestingly, in your last interview, Marie kind of
Mm-hmm.
said something that really made me kind of like, oh yes, 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 that's me.
Yeah.
And that I think potentially I could live anywhere. I don't think there is. Um, I don't think if I went to live in Canada or New Zealand or Holland or wherever, I don't think that I'd have that sort of, oh God, I really miss Scotland. I mean, there's things
Mm-hmm.
I'd miss about it, but
Sure.
there isn't that sort of home thing. It's probably also the fact that my parents had moved as well, so it's not like they had an anchor here and I went away and so I think
Yeah.
that's the joy as well. And they both passed away now, so that's not there. But what has always been really important from a young age is I wanted to have my own home. So I think I was 19 when I got my first mortgage,
Uh-huh.
um, and then moving up to Scotland and having a house and a garden and it's not the aesthetics of it. It's mine. This is my flag in the ground. If I don't have one that's an actual country, then at least this small bit around
It's your
me
place.
is
Yeah.
is, is home. And I think it's illustrated by the fact I got divorced about 10 years ago, and due to the arrangements, it was only 2 years ago. After renting for 8 years, I was in a position to buy a home again,
Mm-hmm.
and I can't tell you how that feels. And the place it's in, there's a lot of good things about this little town. I'm in Fife now,
Yeah.
but there's some things that it's not where I would have chosen to live as well.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no denying that my house, my garden that's my stability. That's home.
That's your space that you've claimed to be your own.
Yes.
Well, we've been talking for almost 30 minutes now. That's flown by. Um, I like to finish on a positive note. So my final question to you is, what would you say is the most positive thing about your TCK experience?
Overwhelmingly, the most positive thing is tolerance. Um, you learn that, or you get that in a way that you're at risk of not getting by staying and living in the same place.
Mm.
And especially, looking at sort of recent events with George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter campaign.
Mm.
You know, it was one thing to think, well, I'm not the kind of person. I've never been sort of racist and stuff like that. But I think when you spend so much time thinking about the things you should and shouldn't do, or maybe you have to do, or changes you have to make yourself, it made me realize that it's not enough to be like that. I have to get back to being that part of myself that's not afraid to say what I think, or to try and positively impact other people, and realize that dodging or avoiding people that come out with racist things, whether intentional or not, dodging and avoiding them is kind of one thing, but it doesn't change anything. It doesn't do anything. So I think that sense of wanting a more global harmony.
Mm.
I'm not about
Mm.
I'm not about to burst into song,
As you
but
wish.
I think that, and I think it's a big advantage you get from being exposed to other cultures.
Yeah. But from my own experience as well, I'd absolutely have to agree with that. For sure. Well, thank you so much, Paul, for being my guest today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been a real pleasure for me, Jen. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to People Like Us. If you'd like to join an online community full of people like us, hop over to Facebook and search for People Like Us. You'll find my group, and you're very welcome to join us.